What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Dr. Joey Munoz Show, where we talk about all things health and fitness. Today, we're going to be talking about the differences between animal based and plant based proteins and discussing them in the context of muscle growth. So, which one is better? Let's go ahead and get right into it and start off by talking about the major differences between animal based and plant based protein powders. So, the first difference is total protein quantity. And when I talk about total protein quantity, we're really talking about protein density, or how much protein you get per unit of food, right? And in general, animal based foods have greater protein density, right? In general, most animal based foods, whether it's eggs, pork, chicken, beef, fish, tend to have around 20 to 25 grams of protein per 3 ounce serving, right? That's pretty high in protein. Whereas plant based protein sources, and we're talking about the high ones here, like legumes, beans, chickpeas, lentils, things like tofu, for example, tend to have 8 to 10 grams per serving. And we're talking about per serving here, we're talking about like similar amount to a serving of meat, right? So animal based foods tend to have about twice the amount of protein per unit of food compared to plant based protein sources. So, in general, animal based protein sources have more protein. The second difference to really talk about is the amino acid profile. And this one's really important. I'm going to first off give a little bit of a discussion or explanation on what amino acids are and why they're important. Okay, so proteins are actually made up of amino acids. Amino acids are the individual building blocks that, when you put them together and they congregate and form different things, they form essentially what are called proteins. And we have a total of 20 amino acids, 9 of which are considered essential. Essential meaning that you have to get them in the appropriate quantities from your diet because your body can't produce them, right? The other 11, the non essential ones, your body can actually produce them as a byproduct of different metabolic processes, and you can produce them from the essential amino acids as well. So, in order to right, like getting sufficient protein is important. You have to get enough protein, but you also have to get enough of the essential amino acids. And in general, when you're eating sufficient total protein, you don't have to worry about this because it kind of just takes care of itself. But it is important to understand that you do have to get an adequate amount of those 9 essential amino acids. Now, why am I talking about this? In general, animal based protein sources have an adequate amount of all 9 essential amino acids. So we call animal-based protein sources complete proteins. Okay, the term complete protein just refers to a protein source that contains the adequate amount of all 9 essential amino acids. Now, on the other hand, plant-based protein sources, for the most part, are incomplete proteins, which means that they do not contain the appropriate amount of all 9 essential amino acids. They typically contain all 9 essential amino acids, just not in the appropriate quantities. Okay, so you might be thinking, if you're hearing this, wow, like plant-based proteins are really inferior because these 9 essential amino acids are important, and most protein sources coming from plants don't have the appropriate amounts. And you'd be right to think that. But the thing is, if you eat a wide variety of different plant based protein sources, you're not getting all of your protein from just one source, which most people don't, then you typically don't have to worry about it because they complement each other. And that's essentially what we call complementary proteins, which are two different protein sources that, when put together, have an adequate amino acid profile, right? A perfect example of this is rice and beans. So, rice is high in an amino acid called methionine, which is one of the essential amino acids, and it's low in lysine, which is another one of the essential amino acids. Now, beans, on the other hand, are the exact opposite. They're high in lysine and low in methionine. So, if you only ate rice, right, you would be deficient in one of the essential amino acids, being lysine. And if you only ate beans, you'd be low in the other essential amino acid, being methionine. But when combined in your diet, and you don't have to eat them both at once, but if you eat rice and beans and other plant based protein sources, you're likely getting an adequate amount of all of those essential amino acids. So it's typically not something you really have to worry about unless you have a very low protein um, unless you have a low protein diet and you're focusing on mainly plant-based foods, you might not be getting the adequate amount of all 9 essential amino acids. But in general, this is something that tends to work itself out. Now, another main difference is the leucine content of of animal and plant-based protein sources. So leucine is another one of the essential amino acids, and it's actually the main and most important amino acid for stimulating muscle protein synthesis. Okay, so muscle protein synthesis is the process by which we stimulate muscle growth. Right? And there's actually this protein called mTOR. That's mTOR, which is the first protein that you have to activate to stimulate this muscle protein synthesis cascade or mechanism. And leucine is the amino acid that initiates that process. Without leucine, without an adequate amount of leucine, you can't really stimulate that muscle protein synthesis process. Okay. So when we talk about eating protein after training or throughout the day to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, yes, protein is important because you have to have total adequate protein, but you also have to have sufficient leucine. And in general, the science shows that you want to consume at least 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine per meal to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Again, this isn't something you have to worry about because if you eat adequate protein, in general, you'll be eating sufficient leucine. But here's the difference. Animal-based protein sources tend to have between 8 to 12% leucine content, whereas plant-based protein sources tend to have about 5 to 8% leucine content. So slightly lower there. And if you want to get to that 2.5 to 3 grams per meal, well, with an animal-based protein source, you can get 30 grams of protein. And since it's about 10%, you'd get the 3 grams, right? With plant-based proteins, you might have to get into the 40 to 50 grams per meal to get the same amount of leucine. Again, it's not saying that plant-based proteins are inherently inferior. It means that you have to eat more of them to get the same amount of these things that you need to be getting in order to get the optimal benefits of consuming sufficient protein. Hey guys, some of you may not know that I'm the scientific advisor for a supplement company called Outwork Nutrition. I help with the formulation of new products to help ensure that they're effective and backed by science. Unlike many other supplement companies out there, we don't rely on exaggerated claims or flashy marketing tactics. Instead, we let the science speak for itself. We take pride in formulating products that deliver real results, helping you achieve your fitness goals in a meaningful way. If you're in the market for supplements like protein powder, pre-workout, or recovery products, make sure to check us out at outworknutrition.com. And as a thank you for being an avid listener of this podcast, use code Joey for an exclusive discount at checkout. You can find the link to our website down in the description of this podcast episode. Remember, our goal is to empower you with science-backed supplements that truly make a difference. Choose Outwork Nutrition and elevate your fitness to new heights. And the last big difference is bioavailability, right? The phrase "you are what you eat" is a good one, but it lacks some context, right? It really is you are what you can absorb, because everything you eat isn't completely absorbed in your intestines, right? And this is where the conversation about bioavailability comes in. In general, animal-based protein sources are more bioavailable, meaning that you can absorb a larger percentage of them and use them compared to plant-based protein sources. And it's not that the protein itself is less bioavailable, it's that plant-based foods also contain high amounts of fiber and other phytonutrients, things like phytates, oxalates, lectins. And fiber and phytonutrients, by the way, have a number of health benefits. So I'm not telling you not to eat these things. You should be including them in your diet, but they can, to an extent, inhibit your ability to absorb protein efficiently. So you actually excrete more of it. The difference isn't massive, but there is a difference, right? So plant-based protein sources are slightly less bioavailable for those reasons. So now you might be thinking, well, plant-based protein sources have less protein overall. They don't have the best amino acid profile compared to animal-based protein sources. They have less leucine and they're less bioavailable. That must mean that they're not nearly as good for building muscle. And the truth is that it really depends, okay? When it comes to building muscle, total protein intake is the most important variable, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, if you simply eat more protein, bioavailability doesn't become an issue because you override the need for super high bioavailability simply by eating sufficient protein. And sufficient protein is lower than what you guys think it is. We'll talk about that in a second. As far as leucine content goes, again, if you're eating sufficient protein, you'll get the leucine, whether it's from animal-based or plant-based protein. The amino acid profile, again, if you're eating a wide variety of plant-based sources, you're going to be getting all 9 of those essential amino acids. And in terms of protein density, again, if you're just eating sufficient protein, it doesn't really matter. So the truth is that it depends. It depends on how much protein you're consuming. If for some particular reason you are on a lower protein intake, then you can definitely argue that animal-based protein will result in more muscle growth simply because objectively, animal-based protein sources are of higher quality for the reasons that we talked about, right? Leucine content, amino acid profiles, bioavailability, protein density, etc. That being said, as I just alluded to, when you are consuming a high protein diet, which most people who care about health and fitness are doing so, or at least are striving to do so, it probably doesn't matter all that much. Okay? And there are some meta analyses indicating that animal-based protein sources may be slightly better for muscle growth, but they don't control for total protein intake. So what I want to share with you here are the specifics of a really cool study titled High Protein Plant-Based Diet versus a Protein-Matched Omnivorous Diet to Support Resistance Training Adaptations, a comparison between habitual vegans and omnivores, which was published in the Journal of Sports Medicine. Okay, the purpose of the study was to compare the effects of a high protein plant based diet versus a protein matched omnivorous diet on muscle mass and strength adaptations in response to resistance training. So, exactly what we want to know, right? If I have a high protein diet, does it matter where my protein intake is coming from? Will I get just as jacked and juicy independent of where my protein is coming from? The study included a total of 38 young, healthy men, 19 of them being habitual vegans and 19 omnivores. Okay. Both groups participated in the 12-week study. They had a supervised resistance training program and they consumed 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. For the vegans, it was mainly soy protein and whey protein for the omnivores. And as we mentioned earlier, as I mentioned earlier, high protein is not as high as you may think it needs to be. This is 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, roughly 0.8 grams per pound of body weight. Okay, a little bit less than that. But I say that because most people think they have to eat 1 gram per pound of body weight. Now, to give a little bit of nuance in this study, the participants weren't in a calorie deficit or anything like that. They weren't like ridiculously lean, right? The leaner you are, the lower your caloric intake is, arguably the more you can benefit from a higher protein intake. But if you're just a normal living person, just trying to be healthy, lifting weights, you definitely don't have to eat a ridiculously high amount of protein. You don't have to get up to a gram of protein per pound of body weight, which would be equivalent to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. All right. So they were just consuming 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And the researchers looked at changes in lean mass, so total changes in leg lean mass. They looked at muscle cross-sectional area, which is just how thick is the muscle, right? So a measure of muscle size. They looked at muscle fiber cross-sectional area. So your muscles are made out of individual muscle fibers. And they also looked at 1 rep max for the leg press strength before and after the 12-week study. And the results showed that both groups showed significant improvements in all of the measured outcomes. Okay, both groups had substantial improvements in muscle mass, in muscle fiber cross-sectional area, and in strength. And there was no difference between the vegan and the omnivorous groups. So the conclusion of the study is really that a high protein plant-based diet is just as effective as an omnivorous diet for supporting muscle strength when total protein intake is equated for, right? Now, to give a couple of additional points of nuance here, it's important to understand that these were completely untrained individuals, so new to lifting. It's only a 12-week study, so it's only 3 months. And from a practical standpoint, understand that it might be a little bit easier to consume an adequate amount of protein if you're consuming animal-based protein sources and not just plant-based protein sources, because you do have to eat more food to consume the same amount of protein. But overall, it seems that if you're covering your bases, you're training hard, you're sleeping well, you have a healthy diet, where your protein comes from probably isn't something that you have to worry about a ton, right? So key takeaways, guys. Again, in many ways, animal-based protein sources are objectively of higher quality. That said, total protein quantity, right, the amount of protein that you eat, overrides all of those small variables, because if you eat sufficient protein, you're going to get all of the amino acids. You're going to get sufficient leucine. the bioavailability won't matter all that much because you're going to be absorbing enough, right? So when it comes to general recommendations, I don't recommend going on a vegan diet unless you prefer being on a vegan diet, and that's perfectly fine. And it can be perfectly healthy, but it's definitely not superior for muscle growth. That's for sure. And I think the outcomes when it comes to health are mixed as well. I wouldn't say it's objectively better for health than an omnivorous diet. And most of us are omnivores, right? Hopefully, none of you guys are carnivores because I've talked about how bad of a decision it is to go fully carnivore, in my opinion. But most of us are omnivores, and we're getting some protein from animals, and we're getting some protein from plants. And if you're consuming at least 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight or so, you're probably in a good place. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I hope you found this video or this podcast helpful. If you're a regular listener of the podcast, all I ask is that you take a second to review the podcast and rate it as well. It really does help me a ton. And if you enjoy these short, practical episodes, please, please, please share it on Instagram and tag me. I want to make sure that you guys are actually enjoying these and finding them valuable. And if you're somebody who's looking to improve your health and fitness, you feel stuck, you struggle with motivation, with consistency, maybe you don't know what the right strategy is, and you feel like you'd benefit from some help, feel free to reach out to us. Down in the description, you can download our free ebook. If you haven't done so, do that. You can join our Facebook group. And if you want to work with us, you can apply for our coaching program on our website, Fit for Life Academy. I can't even say my own website name, fitforlifeacademy.health. All of the links are down in the description. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll catch you in next week's episode. Peace.